Testing 1, 2, 3, testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about how ATP is important for muscle contraction. We already saw in one of the earlier voiceovers that it was important to have ATP being degraded into ADP and phosphate to allow for that cross bridge formation between the myosin and the actin filaments. And so when we look at the availability of energy in the form of ATP in a resting muscle, there is some stored ATP present there. But initially what the cell will do in an attempt to generate some ATP, if it's at rest, is it will utilize a compound in muscle referred to as. And so here you see when the conditions are such that the cell isn't really contracting much and there's a lot of ATP available, then what the body's going to do is take that excess ATP and actually degrade it into ADP. And of course, you know that a phosphate group is also made in that process. And here we see what happens to that phosphate group. It's actually slapped onto creatine. We talk about it being phosphorylated to make something called creatine phosphate, and that's what's shown over here. This is creatine. That creatine phosphate can be really, really important because when the cell needs to generate some ATP early in contraction, and that's what this slide shows, that creatine that was made is going to then be degraded into creatine. And so here's the creatine phosphate that we just created when ATP stores were high. We're going to break that creatine phosphate back down into creatine, and then the phosphate group that we pull off of the creatine phosphate goes into the phosphorylation of ADP to make ATP. Okay, so this is usually what's generated initially during strenuous muscle contraction when you're running a race or playing tennis or what have you. It gives you, however, just a couple seconds of energy in the form of ATP. You tap into that creatine phosphate to phosphorylate the ADP into ATP, and then you utilize that ATP. Now, when you consider the creatine phosphate stores and the amount of ATP that is available to a muscle fiber, note that it only gives about 10 seconds worth of energy during intense workout, or say running a race, playing tennis, swimming, that kind of thing. So between the creatine phosphate being used to make ATP and the available stored ATP, you can get about 10 seconds worth of energy before you have to tap into aerobic respiration. We talked about that back in I think it was chapter 3 of the text. Aerobic respiration, you might remember, is that process whereby in a cell, like a muscle cell, glucose is degraded in the cytoplasm of a cell to make pyruvic acid in that glycolysis reaction, actually a series of 9 of those reactions in glycolysis. You can go back in chapter 3 and review that if you want. But we talked about that in great detail. So glucose broken down into pyruvic acid. We did generate a couple ATP directly. We made 4, if you remember, but we burned 2, so we came out ahead 2. And then that pyruvic acid entered into the mitochondrion, where we underwent, remember, the citric acid cycle, where we generate a lot of NADH and FADH2 and a couple ATP, but most of it was derived when that NADH and FADH2 dropped off their electrons in the electron transport chain. Remember that? So that's what a cell has to utilize once it really needs a sufficient amount of energy kind of being made all the time during that strenuous that you're doing, playing tennis, running a race, whatever it might be. Oxygen, remember, is important too, because this is an aerobic process. Respiration is. You got to have oxygen present in order to crank out that 34 to 36 ATP per glucose. And so in the case of muscle tissue, we have this interesting pigment that's actually stored in skeletal muscle called myoglobin. And as it indicates here, it helps provide oxygen to maintain that aerobic state. And that's why often muscle looks dark red due to the presence of this pigment myoglobin. And so it just kind of helps provide an aerobic scenario, at least for some short period of time, before your respiratory system and your cardiovascular system end up taking oxygen from the air, right, sticking it into red blood cells, as we'll talk more about in another couple chapters, and then the blood is transported to the muscle, it's pulled off the muscle, and then it's utilized to help maintain that energy production as glucose is degraded. When you run out of oxygen, or when oxygen stores run low in muscle fibers, like when you're running that race, then the body can no longer undergo aerobic respiration. And you start kicking into what's referred to as anaerobic respiration. So this is off the table. There's no more citric acid cycle. There's no more electron transport. We can only go through glycolysis. And remember, how many ATPs are we making per glucose in glycolysis? Only 2, because we can't go anywhere beyond that because there's no oxygen. Note also that the pyruvic acid that ordinarily would go into the production of a bunch of different byproducts in the citric acid cycle can't do that because there's no oxygen. And so that pyruvic acid ends up getting transformed or transferred, if you will, or changed into something called lactic acid, and that can build up in muscle, can cause cramps, and I think we've all experienced that at some point in our lives probably. So when your muscle turns anaerobic, you're not generating near as much energy per glucose, only 2, right? And you're building up that lactic acid in the bloodstream. And eventually that lactic acid contributes to muscle cramps and so forth. Your body has to convert that lactic acid Your liver is going to take that lactic acid and metabolize it, alter it chemically, and eventually, with the help of more additional energy, you're going to convert that back into glucose. So that's one function of your liver, and that is to take that accumulated lactic acid formed during anaerobic respiration and convert it back into glucose. That takes energy and it takes time. It takes both to make that conversion back into glucose. And so when you talk about what happens to somebody who's, say, running a 10K race or some extreme physical activity for a long period of time, that individual builds up what is referred to as an oxygen debt that has to be repaid down the road as that muscle initially worked under aerobic conditions but then became anaerobic. And it's during that anaerobic time that the oxygen debt begins to accumulate. So what exactly from a muscle physiology standpoint? Well, here's the definition. The amount of oxygen that liver cells require to take that accumulated lactic acid and convert it back into glucose, as we saw in some of the earlier slides there. Plus, we've got to restore the oxygen back in the muscle cells to a sufficient level so as to resupply the muscle with both stored resting ATP levels and creatine phosphate levels. So you got to go back to that pre-exercise scenario, kind of reestablish that in the body before you can pay back the oxygen debt that has been basically accumulating inside the body. And we've seen, you know, pictures of people getting close to the finish line in a race, and they're just physically wiped out, can't hardly walk another step. Sometimes they just, you know, hit that wall, if you will, that physiologic wall, and It's just really a physical and psychological stressor for the body. You want to go on, but you really can't. So what do athletes do to try to avoid building up oxygen debt? Well, they train, right? Any good athlete, whether it's a runner or a skier or even a thoroughbred racehorse, you know, they have to work out, they have to exercise, they have to train, because the more you train, the more efficient you are in reducing oxygen debt. You can maintain aerobic conditions longer, and therefore you have a better chance of winning the race. So here are some various attributes that we have discovered occurs in muscle tissue as a result of training. More glycolytic enzymes. That's, remember, the glycolytic process of breaking down the glucose into pyruvic acid. If you can generate more enzymes, you can break more of that glucose down into pyruvic acid more efficiently. You have more blood supply that often gets formed within the muscle tissue. You can carry more oxygen there quicker. You can get rid of the lactic acid faster if you have more blood going to and from the muscle. More mitochondria, well, that's a no-brainer. You just have more of those little powerhouse organelles, right, that can generate more ATP. That's a definite plus if you're trying to, you know, win that race, win that gold medal, whatever it might be. So there's definitely cellular changes and physiologic changes that occur thanks to training, benefits of training. But I think this last bullet here is kind of important, and that is you can train until the cows come home, or be very dedicated in terms of training, but if you're not genetically predisposed to being a good athlete, and we'll talk more about what that means a little bit later, that doesn't overcome the physiologic limitations as to what your body can do. Okay, so there is a genetic component to that, and if you just think about, you know, racehorses, thoroughbreds, they're bred to run, right? Clydesdales are bred to pull beer wagons, like the Budweiser Clydesdales, you know. So we can breed specific traits into organisms, whether it's, you know, racehorses or dogs or whatever it might be. And there is that reality again that genetics does play a role in athleticism to some extent too. Although training again is something that really pays big dividends as well.